There's four kinds of people in the world. Four important variables that determine almost everything. There's sheep, there's shepherds, there's rams, and then there's wolves. So it's important to know which category you fit into. Although I think everyone who most people would probably think that they aren't in the sheep category. So what's a sheep? A sheep is someone generally who lacks critical thinking faculties. A sheep is the most common type. Almost everyone is a sheep. Most people are sheep. Most smart people are sheep. Most stupid people are sheep. Very few people aren't sheep. In fact, you kind of have to look around for a long time before you find someone who isn't a sheep. I'm pretty sure I'm not a sheep. What's the main qualifier of a sheep? Well, like I said, they can't think critically. Now, what that means in practice is that it's not that they don't have standards for truth. They do have standards. Everyone has standards. They just have a very generic standard. They have a standard that looks at popularity. It looks at popularity and then looks at whether or not the belief structure appeals to them personally. They don't have a standard outside of popularity, So as soon as something unpopular they encounter, unpopularity, then it's like, oh, that's crazy. Sheep are interesting. They have a way of conducting themselves. It's very... Put it this way, a sheep is never aware that these four classes exist. A sheep cannot conceive of that concept. The very concept of that is beyond a sheep. Because a sheep thinks anyone who would put themselves in another category is just an elitist. Right? They can't recognize, the differences between a sheep and a non-sheep. That's what makes them a sheep. If they could recognize, then they wouldn't be a sheep. The fact is they don't. They willingly refuse to acknowledge that there's a difference. And that's what puts them into that generic category. Because to acknowledge that there's a difference would imply acknowledging that you go into the least favorable category of all. In other words, what's the main qualifier of being a sheep? A sheep doesn't know that it's a sheep. Just walk around and baa all the time. So then we have shepherds. Now it's a shepherd. A shepherd is someone who tries to herd the sheep, essentially. A shepherd is someone who does have critical thinking faculties and original ideas, and, well, not necessarily new ideas, but original ideas. They have standards, and their standards are not popularity contests. They have a standard for truth which transcends mere popularity. It's not like something is true simply because something is good and true and correct because a lot of sheep agree with it. Rather, that's actually an important point. Their standards for truth are not popularity contests of sheep. If a lot of sheep think something, a shepherd will look at that and say, well, that doesn't matter. Those are just sheep. Who cares if sheep agree on something, right? Sheep don't know what they're doing. Sheep are sheep. To a shepherd, their standards are something that exist outside of the realm of how many sheep agree on a thing or not. How many shepherds agree on a thing, that could matter to a shepherd, and that usually would matter to most shepherds. I think, if every shepherd agreed on a certain thing, then as a shepherd, you'd probably, that would indicate some kind of truth to it, if all the shepherds agreed, right? But if the sheep agree, that doesn't make any difference. The sheep don't matter to the shepherd, and when it comes to figuring out what the truth is. That's what a shepherd is. So then we have, then we talk the other two classes, shepherds. Shepherds in general, they try to lead the sheep, because they're motivated by they're motivated by two things. One is actually finding the truth, and secondly is presenting that truth to the world. Having the world acknowledge that truth. And those two directions, those two goals are not actually that different. They're actually sort of one and the same, because in order to get the truth to be acknowledged, you need to find it. In order to be able to find it, you need, help, usually, and you need to understand it. Human beings are social creatures. Knowing the truth when nobody else agrees with you would be sort of empty. The very act of having a conversation and sort of telling you this is true and this is false, the very act of doing that presupposes this precedent of you trying to give the truth to other people. You trying to bring the truth as a prophet, as a shepherd, bring the truth to the sheep, bring the truth to the other shepherds, bring the truth to other people. Bringing the truth and finding the truth. And if you bring the truth to people, to other shepherds, then maybe the shepherds can help you find another truth, and you can sort of, it becomes a whole collaborative effort if with other people involved. It's never even people who work in isolation, solitary goal, they're never actually alone, because of how humanity's engineered. We're a social species, right? Even shepherds need other people, even if they think that they're completely isolated and alone, right? Even if they don't want to be with other people, even if they're super introverted, they still need other people. That's sort of how it works. But that doesn't mean that they respect sheep. Needing people, being extroverted doesn't mean you respect the sheep. Doesn't mean you give a shit what the sheep say. It just means that you need people. It just means you need people and you want them to agree, or you want them to help you find the truth. It doesn't mean that the sheer number of them, the sheer number of people who lack critical thinking faculties should sway the truth in any one direction. So yeah, those are shepherds. Shepherds care about bringing the truth. They're carrying it. Having the truth without just having it to yourself, without really having it acknowledged by everyone else would be sort of empty and pointless. Unsatisfying is the word. It would be totally unsatisfying to be a shepherd, knowing the truth while nobody else agreed. You'd be completely isolated. That brings me to the third class, a ram. Now, it's a weird term. I was actually thinking of calling this goat. Goat or ram. Ram is like a certain kind of goat. It's like the goat with the horns, the curved horns, and they ram into you, So the reason, it's like a Russian proverb or idiom, someone who's stubborn, you could say, they're stubborn as a ram. That's what you would say in Russian. I speak Russian, right? So, that's what you'd say. In English, it's translated to you stubborn as a ram. So, the reason the third class is ram is essentially a class for shepherds that don't know what the heck they're doing. Shepherds are, they're insane shepherds, essentially. It's essentially a class for crazy people. This is what the crazy people are. Every crazy person goes into the class of rams. You talk about rams in detail and how they're treated by other classes. It's probably the least favorable class to be in, to be a ram, because even if they're right, it's never acknowledged, because there's some kind of reason, either in the communication or the ideas or something, that prevents the ram from being understood. You could argue that a lot of the people we think of now as shepherds, in the past, people like Socrates, Plato, etc., famous figures throughout history, they were not appreciated in their own time. In their own time, they were hated, more or less. I mean, Socrates was killed by, so these people were seen as, perhaps rams by the societies in which they were in. Right? It's only now that we see them as shepherds. We don't see the shepherds that are alive today. We might view them later in history as these people alive today were in fact shepherds, but we saw them as rams. It depends. It depends on a lot of things. It might be different now with the internet, because now with the internet, even a ram could still find some people to relate to. unless they're a complete crazy ram. It really depends. And then we have wolves. It's the last category. The wolves among the sheep. The only thing you gotta know about wolves is that wolves want to pretend to be shepherds and they want to lead the sheep astray. They also want to, they also hide in the flock. They pretend to be sheep and they pretend to be shepherds at the same time. They pretend to be sheep, but then they try to sort of, move subtly, change the direction of the herd towards where they want to go, which for them is great, but for the herd it usually sends them right off the cliff. So those are the four categories in general. You have sheep who are just plain sheep. They just go where the herd goes. Shepherds who want to lead the sheep. Rams who want to lead the sheep, but they're just crazy and they're actually running off a cliff, but they don't realize it. And then you have wolves who, they want to lead the sheep off a cliff. The only people who actually want to lead the sheep in the correct direction are the shepherds. This is how the world works, my friends. This is how everything works. It's these four animal classes. So, I think about sheep. Sheep cannot tell, what a shepherd is. They cannot detect a shepherd. They can detect a ram. They're very good at, they're not very good at that. And usually they mistake the one for the two. They mistake the two. They can't tell the difference between a shepherd and a ram. To them, anything remotely outside of popular belief is essentially just a ram, even if that's sort of shepherd-like in nature. Oh, one more thing. All four of these classes are like, there's a spectrum, right, for each one. It's not like these are mutually exclusive, completely mutually exclusive class. For instance, there's a degree to one's sheepness, and there's a degree to one's shepherdness, and there's a degree to one's ramness, and there's a degree to one's wolfness. All of these things are sort of measured and objective, and when you look at them, that gives you a good idea of what this person would be like. So people who are a sheep can't tell the difference between rams and shepherds, which is very hard for the rams, because the true rams, and even some of the shepherds, because some of the shepherds would be treated like rams even though they are not in fact rams. They are in fact shepherds, correct. Their intentions are in the right places and they're trying to do the right thing. You could say that for all of the rams perhaps, but you could have shepherds that aren't actually leading the herd off a cliff, but the herd thinks that they are going to be led off a cliff. The other problem is that sheep have no ability whatsoever to detect wolves, right? And what actually ends up happening is that the people who they do call shepherd sometimes end up being wolves and end up leading the sheep off a cliff. So there's a whole bunch of problems here. The people who won't lead the sheep off a cliff, the sheep think that they will, and the people who will lead the sheep off a cliff, the sheep think that they won't. It's a monstrous sort of situation. It's either that or the sheep just have no idea who's trying to lead them anywhere. The sheep believe that they lead themselves, that they have this self-ownership, right? Those sheep, they believe that they have this self-control thing, that they are individuals, right? That they are unique, that they're special. It only takes, just a little bit of observation and just step back from this whole situation just to see how similar all of the sheep really are. It's like, but we're all different, we're all individuals. It's like, no, you're all sheep. Individuality is it's much lesser a thing than you think it is. This is something you want to praise like it's amazing. It's not, right? You're noticing how you're all different, but the sheep are not fundamentally different. The sheep are superficially different. One of them is a little fluffier than the other. One's a little bigger, one's a little smaller, one baws a little louder, a bunch of them baw very loudly and create problems within the social zeitgeist. But they're all still sheep, right? There's no distinctive difference there. You know, they all still do relatively the same thing. And anytime, you know, they eat grass, they shit. Anytime they see something they don't like, they either baw at it or, you know, they follow the herd. They're sheep. This sounds so cynical, but I'm telling you it's true. Individuality exists for the sheep, but it's usually not very interesting. It's usually very superficial. They look slightly differently, they have slightly different interests, but they're still just sheep. Things get interesting, you know, the differences between people get interesting once you go into the other categories. But the thing is, profound differences between people are not actually enjoyed by society. You know, we have this thing, you know, in society where it's just like, everyone's different and it's great. We like diversity. But the thing is, you don't want someone that's too different. And people don't really know what someone who's too different is because they're just used to sheep. They're used to seeing other sheep just like themselves, and the differences between them are just like, oh, okay, you know, they're different. They think that different people means different sheep. That's what sheep think. That's the huge problem with them that I find. To them, to a sheep, you know, a person that's different from them is just another sheep. And it boggles my mind because they're not seeing the similarities that are there, or they're just ignoring them. And when I'm just like, okay, you think that's different? Let me show you a ram. There you go. That's something that's actually different from you. And then the sheep's just like, well, of course that's different. And I'm just like, yeah, that's different. So when you're talking about differences, that's the kind of differences, you know, those are the kind of differences you should be talking about. What you have amongst the sheep is nothing but similarities. That's why it's just like the whole thing where it's like, is everyone different? No, everyone is and has to be very, very similar up to a certain point. At which point you could have like a little bit of individuality on a superficial level. The sheep really mistreat the rams. There's almost no salvation for the rams. And the other thing about rams is that they're just way too stubborn to actually admit that they could ever be wrong about anything. And that's probably because of an error in their mind. They're rams. That's what essentially it means to be a ram, is their error. The sheep are not fundamentally errored. They're not fundamentally flawed. They're not incapable, perhaps, of reasoning. They just don't do it, you know. You could perhaps teach a sheep to do it, maybe. I mean, you could teach a pseudo-sheep, you know, along the sheep-shepherd meter, you know, where someone is on that scale. Someone who's like a pseudo-shepherd, they could maybe become a shepherd. Someone who's sort of midway, you know, either or. Someone who's a pseudo-sheep might sort of defer to people who are smarter and realize that there are, you know, people further on the shepherd scale. A pure sheep, though, maybe not. It would really depend. But at most, you could get pure sheep, you know, true sheep, to at least acknowledge that they are sheep. Of course, that might not be possible because, just by their nature, sheep don't know that they're sheep. That's what I started with. I said that that's what they don't do. So what are the shepherds supposed to do? See, the way it works is no matter what you have, you're always trying to, you know, herd this herd of sheep in towards the right direction. You know, it's like, imagine we're all walking along a some kind of plateau-y area, and everywhere to the right and left is you have cliffs or hills or steep areas, and if you were to lead the sheep down those areas, they would, you know, fall over, and part of the herd would just fall and start rolling down the hill, and there would be a problem there, right? You want to lead the sheep down a smooth path. That's what you're trying to do. It has to be smooth and plain so the sheep can just walk and that without having to think or worry. How do you do that? Right? Because there's always going to be a problem. Now, ideally, what would happen is all of the shepherds would have to get together and figure out what the correct path is and just agree on leading the sheep there. And then the sheep, you know, see, the thing is, sheep don't understand, a lot of sheep don't understand that there are shepherds, so they just follow other sheep. I don't actually know if sheep in real life actually work like this, but in the metaphor, the sheep will just follow wherever other sheep go. And given how big the herd is getting, If part of the herd accidentally sort of strays, then you're screwed. That part of the herd will tumble and fall. So how do you prevent that? Well, the way to prevent that is for all of the shepherds to be leading the herd in the correct direction. And that can only happen if all the shepherds get together and agree and have a consensus on what the correct direction is. So that's what you'd want to strive for. You'd want to get all the shepherds together and have them agree. And if there's enough shepherds, because remember, when a sheep looks at a shepherd, they just see another sheep because, it's a sheep. If enough shepherds all agree on what the correct direction is and start walking down that way, other sheep will see them and be like, oh, maybe that's the way I should go. And then they all start following. And then like the pseudo shepherds will see this and will be like, oh, the shepherds decided to go there. I should listen to the shepherds. And then the pseudo shepherds will go, and then the half sheep, half shepherd people will start following the pseudo shepherds. And eventually it'll become a big enough movement that a large enough mass of sheep will start walking in the correct direction that all of the sheep will just follow and prevent any sort of offshoots or schisms. That's ideally how it would work. And that this consensus of shepherds, they're always, they actually know what the correct path is. They didn't make a mistake, because that's also possible, that they did just make a mistake and they are actually leading us off a cliff. We don't know. But there's always problems, because for one, getting all the shepherds to agree is almost impossible. I mean, you can get pretty close, but you can't get completely there. Furthermore, you're always going to have the problem of leading the sheep becomes more complex when you start to take into account rams and wolves. For example, you could have rams that try to lead the sheep in different directions, that are trying to lead the sheep off a cliff. And some of the sheep might actually, some of the pseudo-rams or, sort of half sheep, half ram people might walk down that direction and part of the herd, strays. You don't want that to happen. So what would you have to do? You'd have to get rid of the rams, get rid of all of them. But there's another reason that the rams are actually good, because of how this whole social thing works. How do we perceive rams? Remember, I said earlier, a lot of the people, famous people, shepherds, what we think of when we look into the past, were actually thought of as rams at the time. What that would suggest is that many of the rams alive today might actually be shepherds in disguise. We don't know. We think of them as rams because we may not actually know. Their thoughts are so far beyond us that we just don't understand their thoughts. So to us, they just seem like rams. But maybe they actually have a point. Maybe they are actually leading us down the correct path, and they know this. Maybe we just can't see it, but they have actually seen the correct path. I remember there's a spectrum between a ram and a shepherd as well, and maybe the pseudo half ram, half shepherd people, those are actually, shepherds. Those are actually future shepherds that might lead us down the correct path. There's also people who could literally just be shepherds, but we might just think of them as rams. It's hard to imagine. There's a whole bunch of different possibilities. And there's also the whole risk that the consensus of shepherds, they don't actually know what's the correct thing, right? They don't actually know the correct path, they just think that they do. What do you do in a circumstance like that? Well, what you need is, you would need a new shepherd to come along to convince all the other shepherds of what the actual correct path is. But see, if all of the shepherds agree on what the path is, and then there's a new shepherd, there's a new person, and he's saying that, look, you shepherds are wrong, this person is going to be thought of as a ram, both by the sheep and the consensus of shepherds. And this person might be a ram, or they might actually have a point and be a shepherd. It's impossible to tell. And honestly, I probably think that that's usually an unforeseeable consequence, that all of the shepherds are wrong. So, typically the consensus of shepherds, I think, would probably be correct. But then again, you don't want to completely eliminate any diverging opinion from the consensus of shepherds, because the shepherds could still be right. And there might be a pseudo-shepherd, pseudo-ram comes along and proves all the shepherds wrong, and then that guy becomes the new shepherd, and then the new consensus is reestablished under that new shepherd. That could happen, right? Right. The biggest problem is the biggest problem here is you can't actually ever really tell who is actually a ram and who is actually a shepherd. There's only a guess as to who's really a ram. You can easily objectively tell the difference between a sheep and a shepherd, or between a sheep and a ram. You can't objectively determine the difference between a ram and a shepherd. The reason you can't is because the difference between a ram and a shepherd requires objective knowledge of, reality and things we might not even know yet. And who's to say that that someone who seems like a ram today won't actually end up being a shepherd 100 years later, when we find out that they were right all along? I'm sure when Nikola Tesla told people there's going to be electric cars and shit, people thought, this guy's fucking crazy. And Turing as well, and all those guys, right? So that's a problem. Granted, there are definitely people who are probably, who we can safely say are probably rams, without a shadow of a doubt, more or less. Not geniuses, misunderstood geniuses like Tesla and Turing and Socrates, whatever, but actually rams that are crazy and don't know what they're doing. I encountered a ram recently, or again, someone I'm pretty sure is a ram. Like I said, you can't ever truly objectively know. This is just my guess. And if I knew this person and if I talked to them in real life, and if I knew them personally more, I might get a better idea of how ram-like they were. But my position is this person was a ram. This was an argument I got into on YouTube, on my Maslow video. You can go check out the argument. And I read, this guy was saying something and I was trying to understand what he said. And I asked him questions, and he was just very, very rude, let's just say. He insulted me. And at the time, I was upset. Someone insulted me, right? I didn't enjoy that. But then when I actually tried to learn about this guy, I realized that any feeling of being insulted sort of just went away, and I just started to feel really bad for him, because it was clear that there was something that he had a very severe case of being misunderstood. And that's the thing about rams, is that they're completely misunderstood. The truth of being a ram is they're misunderstood because they're actually incorrect, not because the sheep don't understand or the other shepherds don't understand. This was a guy who, I still honestly can't tell whether or not he was misunderstood because he was wrong or because he just couldn't explain it. Or maybe he's a shepherd in disguise and I just can't tell, but I felt bad for him because he was clearly misunderstood, and I would feel bad for any rams, and that's sort of what made me think about this whole subject of rams, is that rams are really, I wouldn't want to be a ram. It's the worst possible thing you could be. You are misunderstood no matter what. You are completely misunderstood. Even if you're right, you're completely misunderstood. And even if you're wrong, you think that you're right. So from your perspective, you are here to deliver the truth, and nobody understands the truth. Nobody hears you. You just get ostracized. It's something I can relate to because I'm probably partially ram-like, even in my own thing. If I could, if I had to tell, I at least maybe a half ram, half shepherd, or pseudo shepherd, mostly pseudo shepherd, but most, a little ram-like qualities there. It's hard to tell, but this guy was like definitely a ram, like very far on the ram scale, He was very stubborn, and it was just very sad. And when I got to learn about, looked at his YouTube videos and his Google Plus profile, I basically cyberstalked him, and I figured out this is a very unfortunate individual. I can't imagine living like this, someone who just feels ostracized all the time. It's a hell. I can't, even if you're completely introverted, it would still be hell. Because you can't be completely introverted, right? It would just, I can't imagine, and I feel really bad for him to the point where I just, any feeling of being insulted, I'm just like, I don't care. Anything I feel being insulted by this guy is nothing compared to the kind of pain he probably feels being ostracized by everyone. It's a very sad subject. I almost don't want to talk about rams. You can go check out the channel and the talk I had on my Maslow goods video. But yeah, rams are very unfortunate, which is why I'm sort of saying if we could and should try to eliminate as many rams as possible, just because, right? And it's not even because of shepherds that rams have it bad. It's because of sheep, because a shepherd, or someone like me, I guess, might understand that a ram, might understand the nature of a ram. They might understand that, look, it's not the ram's fault that the ram is a ram, it's just a ram. A sheep, though, thinks that the ram is crazy and will ostracize the ram. Remember, sheep have herd-like mentality without any kind of appeal to standards. So to them, rams are things that they ostracize. They don't like rams at all. Shepherds might try to sort of relate to the ram and understand the ram more. Sheep don't try to understand new things. Remember, sheep just follow other sheep. Shepherds actually try to understand. So a shepherd might be able to relate to a ram more than a sheep would. That's the whole thing. The other problem with this whole machine is the wolves, and I barely even discussed them, but wolf is essentially the category where all the cluster B disorders are. Narcissists, sociopaths, histrionics, etc. These people, I mean, you're not necessarily a wolf if you have some of these disorders, but you are definitely leaning in that direction. You see, a wolf doesn't actually care about the herd. The wolf does what's in the wolf's interest, which fortunately ends up, it ends up leading the flock astray. And it was like Aristotle who said that evil is just not knowing what's good for you. It's possible that the wolves don't actually understand that it's better for them to help the rest of the herd survive. But they don't they don't believe this. They don't think this. They think that they actively try to screw over the sheep for their own benefit. And like by Aristotle's logic, the wolves, it's not actually for their benefit in the long run. And if you read about these disorders, you find out a lot of these people probably don't end up leading very happy lives, once they're old enough and they don't really have friends, or people get wise to their ways. But they would still maybe trick someone here and there into being their bitches, right? The thing with wolves, they might not realize that helping the herd is in their interest in the long run, but in the short run, it's definitely true that for a wolf, it's better to just lead some of the sheep to kill themselves as they fall off a cliff and go eat their corpses and then move on, right? For a wolf in the short run. That's how a wolf thinks, To them, it's better to screw over other people for their own betterment, which ends up leading the flock off a cliff. It ends up leading sheep astray. And, yeah, I mean, it's totally true that it is better for them in the short run. Again, in the long run, and shepherds would argue that in the long run it's actually worse for the wolf. Aristotle was obviously a shepherd. Aristotle said it's worse for the wolf in the long run. Wolf doesn't know this. So in a way, a wolf is kind of like a ram. They don't actually know what's good for them. They are, in fact, leading sheep off a cliff. They are, in fact, going off a cliff themselves without knowing it. So that's an interesting idea. Wolves are kind of ram-like. But what the wolves are completely aware of is that they are, in fact, trying to lead other sheep off a cliff. They just think that leading other sheep off a cliff will help them understand, will help keep them on the cliff, I guess. This is where the metaphor kind of falls apart. But you get the idea. To a wolf, it's like, I can lead some of the sheep off a cliff, and then I know where not to go. Right? That's the wolf's personality. It's like we're walking on this like foggy plateau, and to a wolf it's like, all right, if I kick you in that direction and you fall and I see you fall off a cliff, then I know not to walk there. That's a wolf's perspective. And the shepherd's perspective is like, if you do that, you are actually making things worse for yourself later on. Because maybe the flock eventually realizes that you're a wolf. But yeah, that's a sort of debatable point, but what's totally true is that wolves think that this is for their benefit. And it's probably not for their benefit in the long run. For themselves, they are in fact walking off a cliff just by doing this, just by acting in this way. They are walking themselves off a cliff. They just don't realize it. So what's the problem with wolves? The wolves have the ability, unlike rams, and that's why I put them as a separate class, even though they're both technically walking themselves off a cliff, is that wolves are not dismissed as easily as goats. Goats are very honest. Sorry, rams. Rams are very honest, and the sheep catch wise of a ram, they're like, alright, get the fuck away. For a wolf, wolves actually sneak in and wear sheep's clothing. You know, they disguise themselves as sheep. They try to make it seem like they are sheep. And it takes a while for a sheep to catch wise that this is not actually one of us, this is a wolf. This is a very different type of entity. It's a huge problem because, you know, before that they figure that out, they can do a whole lot of damage, and they actually end up doing a lot of damage to both movements and society. Every great movement that's ever existed in the past, every religion has always been, it's always had shepherds at the forefront. It's always had genuine shepherds, or, you know, rams that convinced people they were shepherds, I don't know, leading the flock. The thing about wolves is that they do not actually have original ideas. That's not how they operate. The whole point of a wolf's life, the wolf is just like, okay, how do I manage to get through this foggy plateau by kicking other sheep off the cliffs to make sure I don't walk there? They don't actually think about it in a sort of constructive way. You know, they just think about, how do I use somebody else? Because maybe, and you could argue, maybe the reason they do this is because wolves are afraid that they're actually surrounded by other wolves, and they have to fight the other wolves, because if they don't, the other wolves will do it to them. And anytime they do kick a sheep off a cliff, they realize, oh, well, that was just a shitty, stupid wolf that I killed there. Maybe wolves, maybe foxes is a better term, I don't know. But they're wrong. There is a fundamental difference between a sheep and a wolf. A sheep doesn't actually want to kick other sheep off the cliff. Despite all of their bad qualities, sheep are not genuinely evil. Wolves are. Wolves believe that they're surrounded by other wolves, and that so they have to compete and they have to engage in antisocial moves in order to get what they want. So what's happened with these big movements throughout history is that they're started by shepherds, and you know, they appeal to people, and so the sheep flock in, and you're going to have a huge sort of organization. The Christian church, good example. Jesus Christ was probably a shepherd. In fact, he's called a shepherd, I think. Yeah, he's definitely a shepherd, and the apostles, all shepherds. But then you give or take a few thousand years, and what happens? The wolves flock in, and they corrupt the movement from within. What happens with this? You know, and by wolf I don't necessarily mean the Pope. The Pope probably isn't the wolf, and the like the cardinals and the clergy, but maybe, you know, individual pastors of some church might be wolves. You know, if they prey on you know, young children, for instance. And a good example of who's a wolf is politicians. Politicians who use religion and who use Christianity to bolster popularity. See, that's the thing that also wolves know how to do. Wolves know how to rally sheep. They know how to do it a lot better than the shepherds do, because the shepherds try to rally sheep under the truth. They try to say, this is what's true, guys, come with us. Come with us, we figured out the correct path. Wolves don't actually, wolves, you know, and the reason that the shepherd's way doesn't work as much is because, you know, what it usually takes is that there's a new shepherd, he comes along and he says, where you guys are going is wrong, there's a better path over here. You know, that's what a shepherd does, and he always tries to change people's minds. Wolves never try to do that. They try to play off of existing popularity. in the zeitgeist. They use what's already there to their advantage. They just say, he's like, yeah, guys, keep going this way, keep going this way. And they have this charisma to them, and the other sheep just flock in. Something's attractive about them. And remember how sheep work, they follow popularity, but they also follow things that sort of appeal to them on a superficial level, one of which is popularity. The other is, of course, things like charisma and sort of like superficial niceties, charm, etc. So even though there could be a shepherd that's trying to lead him to a better path, the wolf doesn't actually give a shit that this path is leading them off a cliff. The wolf might even know that he's leading them off a cliff. He doesn't care, he's a wolf. Right? He's a wolf. But the sheep eat it all up because that's how sheep work, and they follow the wolf. This all coils back to the one big problem with sheep. Sheep cannot tell the difference between a goat and a shepherd, and they have no way of detecting wolves. There's two big problems. Those are the two big problems. They have no way of judging the difference between shepherds and goats. To them, anything that is remotely unpopular and strange is automatically, anything that's remotely new is automatically a goat, and they will treat it like a goat. So any shepherd that has identified a new path is automatically at a disadvantage. The second problem for the sheep is that they cannot, for the life of them, detect wolves. And they be led astray all the time because of these wolves. So, how do you fix this whole problem with the wolves and the goats and the sheep? Well, you can't completely get rid of the goat problem, or the ram problem, because you can't completely get rid of the rams. Because you can't truly identify what is a ram and what is not. And trying to completely eliminate the rams will, in effect, could end up being a very destructive move. Right? Eliminating that diversity in perspectives could end up leading the entire herd off a cliff. The one thing you could do is try to eliminate the wolves, or at least try and teach the sheep to be able to detect the wolves. But remember, sheep are sheep, and trying to teach them anything is fundamentally problematic. So whether or not you could actually teach the sheep to detect the wolves is still a problem. If you could somehow eliminate all the goats, and so all the rams and all the wolves, well, that'd be a huge plus, because the only people left would be, sheep and true shepherds. Then you could just get the true shepherds to all agree on the correct path, and then just follow that path. And you've eliminated all the rams, so there's absolutely no chance that you might be going down the wrong path, right? That'd be an ideal case. To do that, to eliminate those groups, you either have to teach people to be able to detect them, or you have to introduce some kind of genetic engineering that will literally prevent wolves from being born. Because if things like narcissism and things like borderline personality disorder, if these disorders are genetic in nature, then you can just not have them by selecting for the correct genes through genetic engineering. The other solution to this whole shtick, in terms of creating a utopia, is eliminate the sheep. Get rid of the flock completely. Then you just have the shepherds trying to figure out what the correct path is. And given that the shepherds they don't function the way sheep is, they actually look for standards outside of popularity and superficial things, you're a lot more likely to find a correct path amongst shepherds than you are amongst sheep. But eliminating the sheep is a much bigger problem. There's a lot of sheep. The only way to really get rid of them is, again, the genetic engineering thing I just mentioned. If being sheep-like versus being shepherd-like is genetic, then introduce a genetic engineering technology that can have parents or people select for the shepherd-like genes within their children, thus having only shepherds be born. But there's still a problem even with that, is because there's a lot of jobs and a lot of functions and a lot of things done within society that need to be done by sheep, and that only the sheep are willing to do. In a way, you can't say that the sheep are completely useless, is because they're not. They're actually incredibly important. Part of the reason the shepherds even get to be shepherds is because they're sheep. I mean, my whole thing sounds like I'm bashing the sheep, but no, remember, I'm not, because I think of myself as a shepherd. And my goal is not to get rid of the sheep, My goal is to help navigate the correct path. And in order to do that, the shepherd needs a sheep's help, just like the sheep need the shepherd's help. Of course, the issue is that the sheep don't know who is a shepherd and who is a sheep, whereas the shepherd does. Maybe in a utopia where all of the menial tasks in society are performed by technology, you could have a state where there are only shepherds, and that would be a perfect world. You know, eliminate the sheep, eliminate the goats, eliminate the wolves, have only shepherds left, great, everybody wins. But that is a long way off, and as it stands, there's always going to be a sheep-like component to everything. You're always going to have to work with the fact that there are sheep, and you have to work with them in order to get the truth. The only corrective measure I can think of to hold this thing is to actually try and teach people the difference between a sheep and a non-sheep. Actually try and sort of teach people how not to be a sheep, or how to be a sort of a peaceful sheep that can A, figure out if there's a wolf present, that's most important, and B, you know, don't react to every goat-like idea, so every ram-like idea, as if it's being presented by a ram. It could be presented by a true shepherd. So that is the whole construction. Now, of course, I could be just another goat. I don't know. I could be completely off base here. But even if I am just another goat, that doesn't dismiss the whole theory. The whole theory is still the sheep, shepherd, ram, wolf theory still holds, even if I am a ram. Even if I'm destroyed by my own creation, then so be it. But this whole thing is certainly valid. Most important thing to figure out and ask yourself is, what are you a sheep, or are you a shepherd, or are you a wolf? And unfortunately, I feel like the only answer to that question, the only honest answer to that question, can be answered by true shepherds and no one else. Because again, everyone seems to think that they're the one that's right. So everyone thinks that either they're the shepherd, or that shepherds, goats, and shepherds, rams, and wolves don't exist, and everyone's just equal, which is an even bigger lie, and a lot worse, and probably propagated by, sheep because it makes them feel good, and wolves because it makes them popular amongst the sheep. The truth is, there is a difference between sheep and shepherds. It's important to acknowledge the difference. It's not the worst thing in the world to be a sheep. It's not that bad. You don't want to acknowledge that you're a sheep, but it legitimately isn't that bad. Compared to being a ram, it's a lot worse being a ram. Trust me, it's a lot worse than being a ram. As someone who has seen that kind of existence, not just this guy I talked to, but just because I'm, again, partially ram-like, it's a lot worse to be a ram than it is to be a sheep. And it's probably worse to be a wolf as well. You don't end up, leading a happy life in the end as a wolf. You probably end up dying young. But yeah, the sheep-shepherd difference, that's an important difference to acknowledge. Anyway, this whole Animal Farm freaking metaphor. The thing is, kids. The thing is, be very careful with who you're speaking to. Are they a sheep? Are they a ram? Are they a wolf? Or are they a shepherd? I think you can tell pretty well with how the person reacts. If they react emotionally, very emotionally, and they sort of, obviously, again, like I said, this whole thing's a spectrum. Everyone's partially ram-like and partially wolf-like and a little bit sheep-like. The more emotionally they react, the more sheep-like they are. Because the more emotionally they react, the more that shows that they're not really trying to understand and they're not really trying to think. They just look at this thing that's different and react the way that a sheep reacts. So yeah, there's that. There's people, people I criticize. Stefan Molyneux. Stefan Molyneux is definitely a Wolfram. Wolfram Alpha. It's interesting. Wow. He's definitely part wolf. He's definitely part wolf because he's dishonest, and that's how you identify wolves. Is that they're clearly dishonest, and they're not dishonest for emotional reasons because sheep are dishonest to themselves. But the thing is, the sheep don't know this. The sheep are just lying to themselves without realizing it. Wolves might be actively lying, and they know that they're actively lying. So that's why I think he's a wolf. He's also definitely partially a ram, because I think on some level he also believes his own garbage. He's definitely not a shepherd. Sort of the problem is the popularity that he's gained. You're always going to have sheep in any movement, even there's probably sheep amongst my viewers now. There's not that many of you, but some of you are definitely sheep. Guaranteed. Some people watch this and just have a totally sheep-like reaction. It's hard to tell. You'd have to be in front of the person, but they're always going to be there, no matter how popular a movement is, no matter how smart it seems to be. Even if it's completely full of intelligent people, there's still going to be sheep present, because sheep just flock wherever, okay? That's a sheep, man. That's just how they work. They're everywhere. You can't avoid the sheep. There's going to be a sheep in every single situation in life. There's probably a sheep in every single family. Well, maybe not every family, but there's a sheep in every neighborhood, at least. Even every physics department, there's a sheep. Can't avoid the sheep. But yeah, maybe you could teach the sheep to sort of learn to not cast judgment, to learn two things I keep mentioning. To identify wolves and to not try and judge the rams as much. Because A, that makes things very hard for the rams, and B, rams might actually have a point some of the time, and definitely try to identify the wolves. That would be issue number one. Wolves are a huge problem, and we need to be aware of them. So, children, hopefully that was amusing. Don't take everything I said totally seriously. This is just sort of a jokey metaphor, but there is certainly some truth to all this, to this wolf, ram, sheep shepherd theory. That's what we call it now. The SSRW theorem. The SSRW theorem. I'm gonna quote that. All right. Cheers and good luck, and yeah, help identify the wolves and the rams and the sheep and the shepherds, and lead us through the fog.